Mr. Lincoln, it is an absolute pleasure to meet you, sir. Let me tell you, sir, I don't know if I have ever been more honored than I am now. So Abe, well, may I call you Abe? Thanks, Abe. Well then, how does it feel to be back at the White House? Well, I'll be honest with you, W. Get it? I'm honest, Abe. It's been an awful long time and I really can't even remember. Well, then you tend to forget quite a bit when you get shot in the head. But speaking of heads, that is a mighty fine hat you got there, George. Not as nice as mine, but that isn't all your fault. They just don't make them like they used to. Well, Abe, that may be true. But aside from new styles of hats, we have figured out a lot more. For example, we have figured out loads of information about this process called the cross-bridge cycle. Tell me more, George. Well, Abe, it really is all about these two filaments, actin and myosin. Together, a bunch of actin thin filaments and myosin thick filaments make up what we call a sarcomer. These sarcomeres are the smallest units of muscular contraction. Well, that is all very interesting there, George, and I cannot believe you have figured all that out. Now, George, tell me a bit more about these sarcomeres, as you call them. Well, the sarcomeres themselves are broken up into different bands and zones. The bands are broken up based upon which filament or filaments are present. The A band consists of both actin and myosin. But now, Abe, within this A band there is an area that only contains myosin filaments, and we call this the H band. Next, the part of the sarcomer that contains only actin is called the I band. Furthermore, Abe, the M disc is in the middle of the H band, and it is where the myosin filaments attach. Likewise, for the actin filaments there is the Z disc, but this one is in the middle of the I band. Ya got all that, Abe? Well, George, that is a lot of information, but I think I am following along. All that knowledge seems great to have, but how is it that these two filaments work to contract? Well, Abe, I am glad you asked. It all starts with calcium ions, because at rest the actin filaments are blocked by this protein called trypomyosin. This protein does not allow myosin to bind to actin, and therefore we get no contraction. But when we want to use our muscles, we release calcium. The calcium ions, which were released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, bind to troponin. Troponin is the regulatory protein that holds trypomyosin in place. Troponin changes shape and thus moves trypomyosin aside, revealing the binding sites of the actin filaments. Still with me, Abe? Yes, sir. Keep going, George. Good. Well, now that the trypomyosin complex is out of the way, the heads of the thick myosin filaments can bind to the actin binding site. Why is that important, George? Well, now that the binding sites are unimpeded, the cross-bridge cycle can take place. Since this is a cycle, where we start explaining is arbitrary, well, how about we start with ATP bound to the myosin head and the cross-bridge in the inactive 45-degree conformation? Huh? How did you know that? Well, that is just clearly the most sensible place to start, George. Because then ATP is split into ADP and inorganic phosphate, which energizes the cross-bridge from the 45-degree conformation to the 90-degree conformation. It is in this conformation that the myosin head weakly binds to actin. Then the phosphate is kicked off and the actin and myosin are now in the strongly bound state. It is important to note, George, that tension can only be generated by the muscle when the cross-bridge is in the strongly bound state. This release of the inorganic phosphate begins the transition from the 90-degree conformation to the 45-degree conformation of the myosin head, and the conformation change is completed by the kicking off of the ADP molecule. This ends the power stroke portion of the cycle. Also note, George, that the duration of the power stroke is dependent upon the load. This is in contrast to the splitting of ATP, which is independent of load but rather dependent upon the type of myosin ATPase in the fiber. After the power stroke, ATP binds to the myosin head and it is again in the unbound state. This process is repeated several times to give the effect that we call a whole muscle contraction. Well, Mr. Lincoln, I must say that I am impressed. I had no idea that you could have known all that. Well shoot, I freaking abolished slavery. I think I can handle the cross-bridge cycle.